Today I'm going to share my thoughts and all of the discoveries I made while diving deep into Nile's discography for the first time. Those who are not familiar with Nile, they are an Egyptian technical death metal band hailing from Greenville, South Carolina. Now I did try to figure out how far away Greenville was from Egypt and found out that it would take 16 hours to fly to the Pyramid of Giza, which is the largest pyramid, and surprisingly it would only cost $1,200. Not entirely bad. Nile, which is obviously named after the mighty Nile River in Egypt, the band's music is as epic as the name, with a rich blend of Egyptian imagery and themes used throughout their album covers, and with lead vocalist and main songwriter Karl Sanders weaving tales of pharaohs and occultism in their song lyrics. Nile offers a truly unique listening experience for death metal music lovers. Going into this deep dive, I was expecting two things. The first was a lot of traditional instruments and Middle Eastern elements to be used in order to make me feel like I was in Egypt, riding a camel with the desert behind my back, feeling the eerily creepy vibes of these massive pyramids with whispers in the wind. You get my point. And since Karl Sanders is also a history buff, I was expecting to be edumacated on ancient Egypt or various historical findings that were similar in theme. So not only could I jam to these death metal music, but I could also feel like I learned something during the process. And I wanted Nile to make me feel like I was Brandon Fraser in The Mummy, right? Which is perfect because I just watched The Mummy and The Mummy 2 for free on Tubi. I was more than a little prepared for this discography dive. Holy shit! Oh my god, Bubba, did you see that? Look at that. Rusty, what did you do? So my journey began with Nile's first album from 1998, The Catacombs of Nefa. The album features the original lineup with singer and main songwriter Karl Sanders, who I mentioned earlier, as well as Chief Spires on bass and Pete Hamora on drums. Now the album title is inspired by an H.P. Lovecraft novel, specifically a sentence from his short story, The Outsider, which is set in the same universe as Cthulhu. It's worth noting that Nefa, the name featured in the album title, is actually a fictional creation of Lovecraft and not a real historical pharaoh.
This dude, H.P. Lovecraft, is such an inspiration for so many metal bands, man. I mean, who even is this dude? Can you even name like 10 Deicide songs?
Well, you see, Deicide wasn't really actually a thing when, H.P. Lovecraft was alive, so, I don't even think metal was even a concept back then.
Oh, so he was a poser, huh?
No, I mean, like, he was an author, and that he...
Figures.
What amongst the Catacombs of Nefa blends groovy, slow, melodic sections with fast blast beats, merging old school technical death metal and traditional Middle Eastern elements. The album creates an immersive atmosphere that feels very cinematic, exactly how I felt watching The Mummy.
Oh, that is just so fascinating. I just can't believe they... I'm sorry. You know what? I don't think I'm supposed to be in this area. I'm so sorry. I'm in a tour. Okay, have you seen... Do you know where the restroom is? I think I might have shit my britches.
Use of instruments and choir adds depth, making this record, in my opinion, a great debut for such an interesting band. And I would definitely say that it does cater more towards the Egyptian themes than it does the tech death, but I'm not really complaining about that. One of the first tracks on this record, which is an absolute banger, is called Cthulhu Maku, which Google translates this language as being Hausa, which is used in various parts of Africa, such as Nigeria and Chad. Not necessarily used specifically in Egypt, at least based on the quick research that I did, but that's because Cthulhu is actually a name for a type of important stone document, usually proving land grants or documenting victories of war after the fact. And its connection is actually based in Mesopotamia, just north of Egypt, in what is now known today as Iraq, where the word Maklu relates to 8 tablets that contain a manual for a Babylonian anti-witchcraft ritual performed by Mesopotamian rulers, as well as the complete text of all of the incantations for the ritual. I will let you know that this album and another later album we'll get into called Ithyphallic is one of the only 2 albums that Nile has with no liner notes containing the inspiration behind each track. Carl Sanders really likes to let you know what these songs were actually about. To move on to Nile's second album, Black Seeds of Vengeance, which was released September 5th, 2000. This would be the first album where beloved supporting guitarist Dallas Toller Wade would join the Nile historians. Unfortunately, before the recording process really began, Pete Hamora would sustain a shoulder injury during their previous tour, which would eventually force him to retire his position as Nile's drummer. This would lead to Derek Roddy stepping in as a session drummer, playing for most of the album except for track 10, To Dream of Ur. Overall, this album was much better in production and tone. The album was more aggressive and had a bigger sound, and it was more polished and more mature. Black Seeds of Vengeance was very similar to their first album, focusing more on these Egyptian themes rather than the tech death elements. I really liked the title track. It kind of reminded me of Immolation, although some of the vocals were a bit corny. The Black Flame opens up with this kind of Dune-like atmosphere and evolves into one of the heaviest tracks on the album. I felt like we were going off to war in Egypt this time around, rather than just, walking around haunted catacombs. This definitely felt more like we were fighting other Egyptian tribes and dealing with the anger of the gods, and then also praying to the gods, something like that. The third to last song, To Dream of Ur, was instrumental about halfway through, and then after that you kind of get these 2 chill instrumental tracks where I feel like there's no real aggressive high note that the record ends on. And throughout the liner notes of this album, a fictitious book called The Papyrus of the Undying is referenced as inspiration for many of the songs, including the track Chapters for Transforming into a Snake. Now, Carl Sanders actually based this fictitious book on a real piece of script called The Papyrus of Ani, or otherwise known as the Book of the Dead.
I think this may be the Book of the Dead.
Papyrus was actually a reed found in the River Nile that was traditionally used as a thick piece of paper for writing scripts. It was actually known as one of the first documented pieces of paper used for writing. Ani was considered to be the sky god, so essentially this translates to the script of the sky god. And if you remember in the movie The Mummy, the Book of the Dead is referenced there, but it's depicted as this massive black Bible looking thing, and this is similar. The Book of the Dead was sort of a funeral Bible of sorts for ancient Egypt that was passed down through generations and updated over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. The text contained magical spells that were supposed to help a deceased member have an easier transition through the underworld. With historians predicting that the Book of the Dead began around 1550 BC, which would make this specific book between 5200 and 4200 years old. That would mean the Book of the Dead is actually older than the Bible. Nile's third album in their Darkened Shrines would be released in 2002 under their parent label Relapse Records. We of course would see yet another lineup change, with Tony Laureano taking the official place as Nile's new drummer, and Dallas recording bass as well as his guitar parts, since Chief Spires ultimately quit the band before the recording of this album. This would begin the rather unfortunate trend that many smaller bands face, and that is the never-ending cycle of lineup changes. Musicians have been known for what feels like centuries to be some of the most flaky people out there. Don't deny it either, because I can be flaky too. This album kicks off with The Blessed Dead, which opens up with this intense, high-energy choir and powerful guitar riffs that create this kind of controlled chaos. The album's finale in their Darkened Shrines is a 4-part epic, with part 1, Hall of Saurian Entombment, being an instrumental intro with trumpets, drums, and this cinematic choir, which really sets the tone. Part 2, Invocation of Seditious Heresy, brings back that kind of death metal vibe with choral chanting and echoes of deicide's brutality. And then it ends with this kind of melodic atmosphere outro. Part 3 is pretty decent, while part 4, Ruins, closes the album with an instrumental track that, while initially feels underwhelming, it does have the potential to grow on you over time. The liner notes from Carl Sanders specifically states that the song Keftio Asar Buchie. I feel like I need to have a disclaimer of like, I definitely like put these lyrics in Google Translate and I tried to find any sort of pronunciation, and I don't know whether he just pulled these names out of his ass or what, but I could not for the life of me get like audible references on how to pronounce these names. The liner notes from Carl Sanders specifically about this song talk about a piece of text called the Book of Gates. This piece of funerary text features 100 scenes that tells the story of a newly deceased soul's journey into the afterlife, traveling alongside the sun god Ra through the underworld during the night, leading to his resurrection. The soul must pass through various gates at each hour of the journey, and each gate is guarded by a different serpent deity connected to a specific goddess. It's crucial that the deceased knows the names of each of these guardians, and in the final 3 hours, the judgment of the dead is depicted. The text suggests that while some souls will pass through unscathed, others will endure torment in a lake of fire.
That's brutal.
Following this record, we come to Nile's 4th album and arguably their best work, and that would be Annihilation of the Wicked from 2005. This record would also feature new Nile band members, including a bass player John Visano and new drummer George Colias. And you know what? I don't even need to know why Tony Laureano quit the band, because I'm just going to chalk it up to flaky band members at this point. Unlike their first 3 albums, Nile does pull back on the Egyptian themes. I mean, as much as you can, obviously, knowing that ancient Egypt is your whole shtick. I think one of the reasons this album stands out is because it doesn't have all of that mellow, melodic Egyptian interludes between the tracks. Not that those were bad, but unlike the last 2 records, which ended on these, low, mellow instrumental tracks that really disrupted the overall flow and buildup of energy that we felt, at least in my opinion, this record ends with a track that is just an absolute groovy banger. And that allows for the record to end on this really great high note. The final track is instrumental, like I said, but it works perfectly. It remains heavy, it remains groovy, it's brutal, it's got this soft fade at the end, and it's exactly how I wanted the album to end, and it's exactly how I wanted the previous 2 albums to end. Annihilation of the Wicked is also one of the first albums to feature a brutally long song title called Chapter of Obeisance Before Giving Breath to the Inert One in the Presence of the Crescent-Shaped Horns. It's an absolute troll song title, but what's even funnier, and probably why Nile has such long song titles, is because of the Book of the Dead, which this song is based off of. Now, the Book of the Dead is known for having these ridiculously long chapter titles, at least according to Mr. Carl Sanders himself. Now, being the curious little bee that I am, I went hunting to find at least one of these chapters, and boy, Carl Sanders was not lying. Book for making the transfigured spirit excellent, knowing the names of the gods of south and north, the gods who are in the caverns, the gods leading in the underworld, performed by a man for his father or his mother on the feast days of the West. We're not done yet. Making excellence in the heart of Ra, in the heart of the gods with whom he is.
That sounds like the black metal song that I recorded for my band called Drowning in the Abyss of Eternal Sorrow. I watched my soul crumble into the void of infinite despair, yearning for the cold embrace of the night's endless grief.
Who even are you?
My bandmates call me Nihilgrim the Unseen.
What's your real name?
Kevin.
Okay, well, Kevin, do you mind going somewhere else? Because, like, I'm kind of in the middle of filming a video here.
Oh, well, can I just stay here? Because, like, my mom doesn't like me to be around the house when she's got company over, so I don't really have anywhere else to go.
Okay, well, can you at least, like, keep it down? All right, I'm, like, almost done with this video.
Okay.
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 Okay. Continuing our journey through the desert, we hop along and find ourselves face to face with Nile's fifth album, Ithyphallic. Now, I'm just going to be brutally honest here and say this is my least favorite Nile record. The album opens up with What Can Be Safely Written, and right off the bat, the production just feels way overdone, especially in the drums. To the point where the drums almost sound programmed. The vocals are rough, and the song drags on too long. Carl's performance isn't great. As he creates, he destroys, suffers from overly crisp and clean vocals with production that feels too polished. The title track doesn't resonate with me at all, and it's surprising how different this album sounds. Papyrus has a kind of deicide-like vibe to it. To no surprise, The Book of the Dead is another inspiration for this album. And that's really all I got. One song on here is inspired from a spell that is intended to protect those in the afterlife from being eaten by crocodiles. Sounds like they have a gator infestation. They should probably call Steve Irwin on that one.
Oh, too soon, man. Steve Irwin was a legend.
What? I ain't denying that he's a legend, girl. Okay, also he died in 2006. What do you mean too soon?
How'd he die again?
Well, he took a stingray tail straight to the heart.
Oh, that's brutal.
For Nile's sixth studio album, we have For Whom the Gods Detest, which was released November 3rd, 2009. Now, my final thoughts on this album is I thought the production and the instrumentation was much better than their previous release, Ithyphallic. I also thought that Carl Sanders sounded quite good on this record. And I liked that it was a mix of their older, like, first three albums, expanding on this, like, traditional Egyptian sound with the slow, brutal death metal instrumentation that Nile is known for, especially on, Annihilation of the Wicked. There were more big melodic sections that were recorded throughout this as well, and overall I thought it was a very well put together project. Now, this is where we do come across some questionable lyrics, which I feel like we should talk about for a little bit. Just like you saw with my reaction to Nile's single about monkeys and feces in promotion of this new album, Nile likes to talk about feces. And Nile does have a song on this album, which I'm just gonna tell you right now, I'm gonna butcher the name, but I think it's called Hit Dung Incantation. There's a lot of T's. But basically, this track, despite the amusing lyrics, is actually kind of a banger, but there's a verse in this song that goes as follows. I mix the dung of a dog, foul canine excrement, with barley flour, smear it on your shoulders, cast it from you, and feed it unto you. God, it is so hot out here, dude. Do you have any sunscreen? Why would we use that, bro, when we can just use poop from the dogs? I'm sorry? Poop from the dog? Hey, man. Poop from the dog, Rusty? Just use her poop. Just smear it on, skin and protects from the sun, bro. So I actually had a subscriber of mine, Surgical Brute, I will shout you out here, who did some research for me on why Nile likes to talk about feces so much in their music. And what he found out was actually quite interesting. When the damned died, their flesh was torn away by demons, and their mummy wrappings were removed so that their bodies were left to decompose. In the underworld that the blessed successfully navigate, their order of things is reversed, even to the extent that the damned have to walk upside down, eat their own excrement, and drink their own urine. So there you go. That explains why Nile likes to talk about feces. It's almost like the ancient Egyptian version of the upside down. All right, so now we're on to Nile's 2012 album, At the Gates of Sethu, which is an album that is based on the Book of the Dead. You got crocodiles mentioned in the fiends who come to steal the magic of the deceased, as well as the Book of the Gates, where Ra has to travel through the many gates in the underworld. Basically, nothing super new here in terms of writing material, which honestly made me quite bored. It just feels like, you know, Carl, you couldn't put anything else together for a song. How many albums can we have that actually talk about the Book of the Dead?
Yes! Yes!
Now, I did feel like this album was still pretty good. There were some great melodic parts, as well as some eerie elements that really made you feel the story that they were trying to tell here. The guitar riffs were good, and the album felt quite epic, in my opinion. And some reviewers said that this album had pretty rough production. I don't know if I heard that necessarily. In my opinion, I thought that the album sounded pretty good in my speakers. So I don't think it's a bad album, but I also don't think it's the most memorable in their discography. But it's definitely better than Ithphalic. Fast forward a few years and we have Nile's 2015 album, What Should Not Be Unearthed. Now, around this point in my listening experience, I began to feel the same way about Nile as I do Cannibal Corpse. A lot of their albums sound very similar to each other. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that a lot of their songs sound the same. They're kind of repetitive. Even though some of these albums do sound the same, there are little differences between these songs that you can pick up on, just like with Cannibal Corpse. What Should Not Be Unearthed opens up with a bang with the song Call to Destruction, wasting no time with a powerful and aggressive start to the album. The album also balances these tight, brutal, and groovy swinging guitar riffs, especially in tracks like Negating the Abominable Coils of a Pep and Age of Famine, which add kind of this sassy edge reminiscent of Obituary and Deicide. While the Middle Eastern flavor is less pronounced on this record, the album's instrumental moments, like with Ushapti Reanimator, set a really nice atmospheric tone, which brings back the cinematic imagery like what we got with the first three albums. Thus, it makes it still a pretty fair album in their discographies. Vile Nilotic writes from 2019. I'm just gonna say right now, this is by far one of my favorite albums from Nile. It delivers a modern, punchy, and aggressive sound that channels the intensity of Annihilation of the Wicked. Tracks like Long Shadows of Dread and The Imperishable Stars of the Sickened blend these epic Middle Eastern influenced instrumentals with these brutal riffs, creating a very cinematic atmosphere, which Nile is of course known for. The album leans less on interludes, focusing more on powerful compositions, as seen in tracks like Seven Horns of War and the war chant driven track That Which Is Forbidden. With its symphonic elements kind of reminiscent of Epica and groovy death-style guitars, this album is definitely amongst one of my favorites. According to Carl Sanders, the title track, and thus the album name, is from an HBO show called Rome, which for context is about two Roman soldiers who are of course caught up in the historical events of the Roman Empire. They encounter war, political intrigue, assassinations, family tragedies, and more, all while being surrounded by historical figures such as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and of course Cleopatra, who is our Egyptian connection. Anyway, Carl says that there's a specific episode where the newsreader is making a political announcement attempting to denounce Mark Antony and demonize him in the public eye. And so this newsreader reads out loud that Mark Antony worships dogs and reptiles. He blackens his eyes with soot. He dances and plays the cymbals and vile Nilotic rites.
He dances and plays the cymbals in vile Nilotic rites.
it. And so Carl Sanders says that once he heard that line, he thought, if that is not a Nile song, then I don't know what is. He explained further in the liner notes and said, it took a while to write it out after I saw that scene, because it's not quite enough to make a whole song out of it. It took a little while for me to figure it out. I had to read a few more books and figure out exactly what needed to be done. This brings us to the moment that you've been waiting for. Nile's brand new 10th studio album, The Underworld Awaits Us All, which was released on Napalm Records in August of 2024. We'll get right into some of my minor complaints for this record. First off, this album has a couple songs that were a bit too long and could probably have benefited from just being chopped all together, specifically the opener and the closer of the album. But personally, I don't think that this is a bloated album. I know there were a lot of people that were saying it felt a little bloated or felt a little too long, but I do think the timing of this record is on par for the rest of Nile's discography. I don't think it's out of place. The final instrumental, I would say, feels a bit too long and doesn't really add anything to the overall experience of the record. The other complaint I have about this record is the production. I personally felt like it was a bit too overproduced and a bit too clean. There's some melodeath elements in here which I did enjoy, but just like some of their albums, there's very little Egyptian vibes throughout this, besides one instrumental that we get kind of in the middle of the album. There's a few gong hits as well as a choir that sounds a bit too flat and not very big. They definitely had better choral tracks in previous records, and the choir that they use is just not, it's just not it. It's just not it for me. It sounds very small and low budget. Now, Carl, on the other hand, does sound amazing on this record, and I think every band member on this album performed very well. So even though it's lagging in a few departments, every musician played very, very well, and George Callias did a good job on drums as well as percussion, in my opinion. So this album also lacks diversity. So I understand that it's tech death, and again, maybe I'm just not super into tech death, but it's just very repetitive. Now, if you're a super fan of tech death, I think you might like this album. If you're a fan of Nile, you're probably going to like this record regardless. But I know a lot of people were saying that this record was fantastic, and, you know, I support you 100% if you like this. I just felt like it was repetitive. Nile's records are interesting because, in my honest opinion, I feel like their best records are where they actually focus more on the tech death music before the Egyptian and Middle Eastern instrumentals. Annihilation of the Wicked was a really good example of this. Those Whom the Gods Detest and Vile Nilotic Rites are great examples of that focus, you know, where in comparison, Nile's first three albums focus more on the opposite. They're more on those Egyptian layers and less on the tech death music. They sound so cinematic as a listening experience, and that's not a bad thing, and I'm not saying it is. So even though those albums are very good, however, their most brutal tracks on those records, in my opinion, are when they focus more on the tech death music and less on the Egyptian themes and instrumentals. It's like putting icing on a cake, you know? The Egyptian themes and instrumentals are a decorative piece of the cake, but it's not taking away from the flavor of the cake. And unfortunately, this album does lack Egyptian themes throughout the entire record, pretty much. The final instrumental on the album offers nothing for the Middle Eastern vibe except for like one lead woman's vocal and what sounds like giant rocks moving, which I will be honest was kind of an interesting listening experience. I'm a very visual listener, so it was cool because the sounds of these giant rocks moving felt like the giant boulders they used in the pyramids, just like being lifted off the ground and floating around me, picking up dust and stuff like that. Exactly like what you see on the album cover is what that listening experience was like. So that I did enjoy. That all said, what makes Nile unique is the fact that they are based on Egyptian mythology. So this also is what makes them a very niche band. I've talked about this. Not everyone is going to be into the mix of, you know, Egyptian mythology, history in general, and tech death. This for me is one of Nile's weakest projects next to Ithyphallic, only because it lacks both of the things that I really enjoy from Nile's discography. The first being the obvious traditional Middle Eastern sound effects and instrumentals. And unfortunately, the actual music, the tech death, lacked for me in a lot of areas on this record for reasons that I mentioned. It was repetitive and it just sounded too clean and too sterile with the production. It was way too overproduced and polished in my opinion. And Nile can do modern day albums with good production. I mean, they proved this with Vile Nilotic Rights, which like I said is right up there with Annihilation of the Wicked for me in terms of how amazing it is. But I just feel like Carl Sanders forgot to add more Middle Eastern elements, or just didn't really know how to incorporate more elements into this record because it sounds so bare bones in all aspects. So in conclusion, this album is probably one of the most bare bone albums Nile has ever written in terms of, you know, the lack of traditional elements, which would be fine if the tech death music held up on its own. But in my opinion, I don't think that it does, because I know they've done better, and it just, both of those elements are just not, they're both lacking and they're not working solo or together very well. And there you have it. There is my review and recap of Nile's entire discography, including their brand new album, The Underworld Awaits Us All. This was a very cool listening experience for me. It was great to finally be able to fully dive into this band and understand their lyrics and the inspiration behind it, get to know Carl Sanders' thought process a little bit more. So if you liked this video, please comment down below what your top 3 Nile records are. I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope you have an amazing day. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye, you guys.